Superheroes spend much of their time saving people's lives. On numerous occasions, they have saved the whole world, and even, on more than one occasion, saved the entire universe. But can fictional superheroes actually save lives in the real world? In October of 1984, BBC News reporter Michael Burke drew the eyes of the world to a crisis unfolding in a corner of Africa. The East African country of Ethiopia was no stranger to famine. Time and time again in its history, fate had pulled the food from the mouths of its people. War, drought, and short-sighted government policies had combined in varying degrees over the decades and even centuries to repeatedly send waves of hunger across its territory. In the mid-70s, civil war had erupted after a military junta overthrew Ethiopia's god emperor Haile Selassie. The years that followed saw the dictatorship fight a series of enemies from within its own borders, each conflict taking a toll on the civilian population as attention and government budgets were directed towards efforts to maintain power. Hardest hit was the north, a part of the country that included the independence-hungry territory of Eritrea, a desire that proved to be a further catalyst for civil war. In addition, as the 80s progressed, the area saw record low rainfalls. Suddenly, a country with already fragile agricultural foundations hit the tipping point. Rains and crops failed. The price of grain doubled, tripled. Farmers were seen attending feeding centres. As drought took root and famine grew in the north, the ongoing military upheaval made it increasingly difficult for relief to reach those who needed it the most. Thus, a tragedy of startling proportions unfolded. A lot of the details in the build-up to the famine were widely unreported by the global press. But then, in October of 1984, came that news report from Michael Burke. The report that grabbed the attention of the world and didn't let go.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th
As
century.
images of starving men, women and, most memorably, children filled the TV screens, some people felt compelled to do more than just shake their heads, and instead they began shaking the collection tin. What followed was an altruistic avalanche that changed the face of humanitarian fundraising forever. By the end of the year, lead singer of the Boomtown Rats, Bob Geldof, along with Midge of Ultravox fame, had pulled various strings, including those of the heart, to organise the charity single Do They Know It's Christmas. This collaboration between the biggest British pop stars of the day went straight to number one in the UK, selling 1 million copies in its first 7 days and staying at number one for 5 weeks. More importantly, it raised £8 million for the famine relief effort. That's 8 million in 1980s money, the equivalent to around triple that today. More high-profile fundraising efforts followed. In particular, March of 1985 saw We Are the World released, as the USA took its cue from Band-Aid, that single raising a mighty $80 million. Then July of that year saw the two legendary Live Aid concerts take place in London and Philadelphia. Entertainers around the world were doing their bit to raise funds and awareness, and that got some people in the comic book industry thinking. One of those people was Bernie Wrightson. Here was a man who was probably the greatest horror comic artist, seeing real-life horrors unfold on his TV screen, and he decided that he could and would do more to help. One day he was around Jim Starlin's house, helping him install a folding staircase in his loft. Jim mentioned that he and several other colleagues were collaborating on a comic book that was going to be sold to raise money for a Marvel employee who needed to pay for expensive medical treatment. Bernie thought this was a great idea and suggested that Marvel do something similar but on a bigger scale for Ethiopia. The two of them pitched their idea to then editor-in-chief Jim Shooter. They wanted Marvel to produce their own version of Band-Aid, of USA for Africa, that would see a who's who of writers and artists and letterers and colourists come together and produce their own Do They Know It's Christmas, their own We Are the World. Jim Shooter didn't take much convincing, nor did anybody else at Marvel. But how's this collaboration going to work? Some online sources, I don't need to tell you which one in particular, claim that they used the exquisite corpse method. You may not be familiar with the term, but you've probably all done it when you were at school. One of your friends would start writing a story, but then fold over the top of the paper. They would then pass it to you, and you would add to the story. Again, you would fold over the top part, pass it on to your friend, and they would add to it, etc., etc. In the end, you would unfold the paper and read the chaotic results to great hilarity. This comic book, however, had a lot more effort invested in it than that. Chris Claremont, X-Men editor Ann Nocenti and Jim Shooter, along with Wrightson and Starlin, all contributed elements to the storyline. Sometimes maybe just a small idea, maybe the outline for the villain, or a fuller idea of a 2 to 3 page segment. Then Chris Claremont would rework and refine them into a workable plot. It would then be Ann Nocenti and Chris Claremont's role to ensure that everybody working on the project stayed on course. Claremont took the project on with gusto, making it his job to get all the writers on board. Wrightson and Starlin did the same with the artists. Once all of the creative teams were assembled, they would each produce a few pages before passing the baton on to the next team. To be honest, it seems that the creation of the finished product was pretty straightforward. Everyone loved the idea and wanted to be involved. The end result was this, with a great cover from Art Adams showing a couple of the characters in my favourite looks for them. The brown Wolverine suit, the high-necked double-breasted singlet for Colossus. Even this outfit for Magneto, although it does have a touch of the Rocky Horrors about those gloves. Charitable organisation Oxfam were heavily involved in aid efforts in Ethiopia, so if you thought that Marvel would turn to them as their partner in this venture, you'd be right. If you thought that Oxfam were happy with this, you'd be wrong. At this point, I have to reference Jim Shooter's own blog, in which he gives a more detailed account of what happened. And actually, it's a really good blog anyway, in which he talks quite candidly about his time at the House of Ideas. I've put a link to it in the description for this video. The potential partnership started badly from the very outset, as Oxfam took the term comic book literally and asked Marvel what it thought was so comic about famine. Even when it was explained to them that comic in this context did not mean comedic, they were still wary of the project and asked to see the finished article before they put their name to it. Anyone would think that Marvel were asking for money from Oxfam, not trying to give it to them. Anyway, after they saw the book, all doubts were removed, and Oxfam said no. I can only imagine the shock at this rejection. But there was more. Oxfam stated that the comic book was unbelievably offensive, that those working at Marvel were both racist and sexist. Under no circumstances would they work with the publisher. They would, however, send a representative to show them what was so awful about the book. One of the biggest issues was that all depictions of females in the story were sexist and exploitative, especially those of Storm, which were more than sexist and a denigration of women of colour. Storm, the first black female superhero. Although some say that was DC's Nubia, but the jury is very much out on that one. A character created and nurtured by a man known for his strong female characters. A character who actually led the X-Men, even though she didn't have any powers. Yeah, such a denigrating character. Oxfam spotted plenty more hatred within the pages too, so yeah, the partnership was off even before it started. Up stepped the American Friends Service Committee, who were delighted to accept Marvel's offer. See, this is their actual acceptance letter, again courtesy of Jim Shooter's blog. It turns out that they were a much better option than Oxfam anyway, as not only did they possess infinitely more humility, but their efforts weren't solely focused on the headline-grabbing events in Ethiopia. They were also dealing with crises in Mali, Sudan, and elsewhere in Africa and around the world. So that was sorted. Shall we talk about the comic now? Chris Claremont, Ann Nocenti, Bernie Wrightson, and Jim's Starlin and Shooter all understandably get story credits, although of course a stack full of other writers wrote the script for the various segments. I'm not going to get into who they are here. I'll do it as we go through the book. I suppose the only other person of note who gets a credit is the logo designer. Some sources will tell you that it was designed by Janet Jackson, Michael's sister. Well, Janet Jackson did design it, but she didn't have a brother called Michael, just the same name as a massive pop star. So many talented people working on a very worthy cause. But did the content match the lofty intentions? This is another one of those comic books, much like Secret Wars 2, that gained almost mythical status for me when I was growing up. Because I would see it advertised in the comic books that I did own, but I never actually saw this for sale. Which is a shame, because I would have done my bit for charity. I would have bought a copy. It kicks off certainly looking like an X-Men book, thanks to John Romita Jr.'s art. But these first couple of pages are actually written by Stan Lee, the first time he'd written the team since the 1960s. Rachel is distressed, and her cry brings the rest of the team to join her, standing at the entrance to Xavier's school. Now, as we all know, the school is situated in Westchester. However, as the team stand on the threshold looking out, they see not the usual Westchester landscape, but the scorched sands of a desert. Kitty Pryde is in that desert. Their postman has collapsed through the heat, and she is desperately trying to drag him in to the safety of the mansion. As Kitty asks her teammates for help, the arts team switches. And I'm sorry, but Klaus Jansson's inks really drag down John Buscema's pencils. Nightcrawler appears to help Kitty, but he quickly teleports away, having apparently looked through the gates of Hades. It's clear to everybody that something very strange is going on, so it's decided that Logan, with his healing factor, will be a safer option to try to help her. But even he quickly feels emaciated, as though he hasn't eaten in weeks. He does make it to Kitty though, discovering that she too is suffering the same fate. She is still determined to drag the postman to safety, but Logan knows something more is going on here. She won't leave the postman to die, so he speeds things along. And as soon as he does, everything returns to normal. Those first 4 pages were all written by the same writer, Stan Lee. That isn't going to happen again until the very end of this issue, as from now on, every couple of pages, the entire creative team changes. The whole postman thing is never really explained, but it is clear to the whole team that someone or something is toying with them. A psychic search by Rachel and a physical search by Rogue suggest that whoever their enemy is, he's gone. Logan knows better. He says he's still there. He can feel him and he'll be back. We now get another former X-Man, John Byrne, on art duties, rejoining the team a few years after he left them. He is paired up with a future X-Universe creative, Louise Simonson. It's later in the day, and the fleshy form of Peter Rasputin is enjoying a swim. His towel seems to attack him, and if he hadn't changed to his metallic form, he may well have drowned. Then when he emerges from the water, things turn very crazy. For a start, a vast metallic citadel erupts from the mansion's grounds. Then, as he calls for his teammates, the individuals that answer are not what he was expecting. Sure, we have Storm, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, even Magneto, but they all seem to have a kind of metallic appearance. All now have their own version of Peter's armour. And they insist that he too needs armour, even as he reverts to his human form. They insist that he wears it to protect himself, so that he will no longer feel pain. And Peter is happy with this. He now has protection from all the possible hurt he could feel in life. But it's not true. Such protection doesn't exist. And he is disgusted with himself for so willingly giving up his humanity for that promise. Inside the mansion, concerns are growing. Although not so much for Kitty, who's going to make a trip to the kitchen. Maybe her mum's chicken soup will help perk Peter up. Let me ask you something. Who, creatively speaking, would make the dream horror comic book team? On art duties, It would have to be Bernie Wrightson, wouldn't it? But what about the writer? That's not so easy. Well, I tell you what, how about Stephen King? Well, do you know what? They both came together on this comic book. Stephen King apparently submitted 5,000 words for what was supposed to be a 3-page section. Somehow Chris Claremont managed to edit that down to 1/10 of its size. And it doesn't disappoint. We join Kitty in the kitchen where she encounters an entity called hunger. Now, I don't have any sympathy with the way that Oxfam behaved. However, I do understand that they must have been expecting something very different to what they got. And this must have been the first time that they thought, comic books aren't quite what we thought they were. They were probably expecting some rip-roaring adventure. But this isn't 1950s Dell. This is 1980s Marvel. And by this point, they must have realised the difference. We then get 2 pages from Charles Vess, a master of mood himself. He also delivers, as we see Nightcrawler go to the aid of a starving Kitty Pryde, only to be assailed himself with feelings of self-doubt and unworthiness. But yeah, we really are being spoilt with this artwork. Now we get that supreme rarity, some superhero work for Marvel from Alan Moore, a man known for carving his own, sometimes solitary path. As such, naturally, he had to focus on Magneto, didn't he? He is using Cerebro to search, and from the very outset, we get Alan Moore's typical poetic writing. Magneto is using Cerebro to search for their unseen foe, but instead his eyes are opened to a once dreamed of reality. A reality where he has led Homo Superior to victory over the rest of humanity. A reality where he stands at the head of a mutant army, their enemies vanquished. And who were his enemies? Men and women who wanted nothing more than to raise their children in safety. And now, as the dead rise once more in masses, he sees that they are the flowers of guilt, the harvest that he has raised. He is the conqueror, and he feels nothing but shame. The great Anne Nocenti then gets to put Rachel Summers through the ringer, as she is reminded of her past, future as a hound, and gets to come face to face with the original Phoenix. Of course, Phoenix never misses out on a big event, just like when the X-Men cross paths with the Teen Titans. We've had a horror writer, now we get another award-winning writer. Harlan Ellison. What next? A great fantasy writer? His tale sees the very human Logan facing off against the more powerful, bestial Wolverine. Logan does emerge triumphant by not killing his enemy, and thereby proving that he is both Wolverine and, more importantly, human. It's when Chris Claremont himself gives us Storm's tale that we see what Oxfam really had an issue with. This whole section is about identity. At this point, Storm didn't have her mutant powers. So if she wasn't a mutant, who was she? And in a mockery of that question, their unseen foe provides various alternate Storms. She has to have an identity, so which is it? Now there are various shown here, but okay, there are a couple that appear over-sexualised, that objectify her, but I assume the people at Oxfam didn't actually read this. They just looked at the pictures and thought, oh, that's terrible. If they had read it, they'd have seen Storm saying she is not a toy, prancing and dancing for amusement. Even this latest manifestation of their foe points out that she is the strong one, the mature one, the adult. I think it's just another example of Oxfam showing that they didn't realise there was more to comics than just pictures. Her section, longer than everybody else's, and as such encompassing a few artists and writers, ends in a custard pie fight, at which point she realises how wasteful this is in a world so full of want. She is encouraged to carry on the custard pie fight. After all, this is war. But she says she is more interested in peace and puts the pies to much better use. So now they've all had their turn in the spotlight, except Rogue, who seems to have been overlooked. And as they recover from their psychological battles, they decide they are going to fight back. But how? They don't even know where their enemy is. Well, actually, Rachel says that she and the entity created some kind of rapport, and as such, she thinks she knows where to find him. All recovered and all together, it is now down to the socially conscious Denny O'Neill to take our heroes via the Blackbird to Africa. Rachel leads them to the dusty heart of northern Ethiopia, where they are surrounded by very little except misery. Surrounded by so many starving people, our heroes want to help. But Peter says, "But what can we do?" A question asked by many in similar circumstances. The artist for this bit is Brett Blevins, and it has to be said that he was a good choice to begin this segment, as his art perfectly reflects the images from those news reports at the time. Images of skeletal people living in and under rags. Something that unfortunately isn't carried on by the next artist, Herb Trimpe. He's a bit of an old-fashioned kind of artist, and as such, I'm afraid that his illustrations just don't carry the emotional weight that they need to. It just looks like a generic African location. The colourfulness of it doesn't help. But look, they don't look like they are suffering or starving. She's smiling. A relief plane has landed full of supplies for those in need. This, by the way, is written by George R.R. Martin. Okay, our heroes use their various powers to initially keep the crowds safe as they desperately surge towards the craft, and then to help distribute those supplies, food, medicine, going to those who need it the most. But for all their efforts of emptying plane after plane after plane of supplies, we are told that nothing seems to change. Colossus says that their task appears hopeless. And anyway, what about the entity that attacked them all? Shouldn't they be looking for him? But Logan points out that glory can wait. What they are doing is far more important. And so their efforts continue. And it is days later that Kitty echoes Peter's sentiments. She says she can accept the humility of defeat in battle, but it's this helplessness that she just can't bear. And we feel their despair. Even worse happens to Rogue. She is feeding some young, weak child when it reaches out and touches her face. Skin on skin. Rogue, of course, cannot control her ability to absorb other people's psyche when they make contact with her. But where this child is concerned, she experiences no psyche, just a lifeless, empty void. And the child dies in her arms. This is too much for Rogue. She feels that the entity is behind all this misery, so she decides she's going to stop it, once and for all. She does this the way that only Rogue can, by visiting in turn each of her sleeping teammates and collecting their powers. The only one who escapes this treatment is Storm. After all, she no longer has any powers to steal. Whilst the others lie almost in comas, Storm comes to and tries to stop Rogue from going after the entity. After all, she believes that not even Rogue, with all of their combined powers, can defeat it. Naturally, Rogue doesn't listen. It wasn't just powers that she stole from her colleagues, she also stole their memories. And using the memories of Rachel and Magneto's experiences with the entity means that she's been able to track it to where it lives. And indeed, she soon finds herself standing outside a mysterious pyramid. Wait a minute, I've just realised. Of course, she's got Rachel and Magneto's combined memories. She has their combined powers too. Whew. Inside the pyramid, Rogue quickly finds herself being attacked by some kind of monster. In fact, it is the physical manifestation of the entity. Rather than use the combined powers of her teammates to take on this creature, which would actually have made for a very spectacular battle, Rogue decides instead to try to absorb its psyche, its powers. But it's a bad move, as she actually absorbs the entire creature itself, its very essence, and now it occupies her body, albeit slightly different. Storm has managed to make her way to the pyramid, and now the entity with all of the X-Men's powers, including Rachel's, senses her presence. And so we get a confrontation not between the powerful entity and a powered-up Rogue, but between the even more powerful version of the entity and a powerless Storm. Of course, the battle isn't always face-to-face. There are plenty of strategic retreats from Storm as she clambers around the temple that they're in. It seems strangely that she is familiar with the place. The entity rants about the ancient civilization that built it, and Storm wonders if it is suggesting that she is a descendant of that race. But the entity doesn't like Storm. She won't give him what he wants. She's too calm, too mentally strong. So, for that, she must die. But the thing is, the longer this battle has gone on, the more of Storm's teammates have woken up, and in doing so, have reclaimed their powers. Nightcrawler is the first to demonstrate this, followed by Colossus, by Wolverine, by all of the others, until finally it's Rachel who tears the entity away from Rogue herself. So is it over? Did the X-Men win? Not really. Magneto says that it's a victory of sorts. Rogue says it's a meaningless victory. The entity still lives. Nothing has changed. Rachel tells us that she felt it, that the entity has existed for as long as the human species and will continue to. It feeds off of humanity's darkness, off of despair, hopelessness, those emotions that it first evoked within the X-Men back at the mansion, and those feelings that fill the plains of Ethiopia. And then it's down to Howard Chaykin and experienced old hand Archie Goodwin to bring the story home. There are theories as to why the entity attacked the X-Men when it did. Maybe it is due to the presence of mutants, the offer of something new and exciting to savour in Homo Superior. Maybe he sensed a threat from them. Or maybe he wanted to test them, to see if they were capable of defeating him. If so, Rogue thinks they may have failed. Nightcrawler says the whole episode has been a complete waste of their time. They have achieved nothing. They couldn't defeat the entity, and they cannot end the famine. It's Kitty who points out that the key to beating both would mean the elimination of misery from across the planet, something that is beyond even them. The best they can do is to continue unloading the planes. And then it's another weak young child who shows us what this is all really about. Once again, Rogue is feeding a young child on the edge of death. On the edge, but not yet over the edge, as he begins to feed. Logan points out to Nightcrawler and the others that this is what it's all about. That child had no superpowers. All he had was hope. And that is the most important thing, the most powerful weapon against all the despair. Without the will to live that hope brings, we are all finished. But, Nightcrawler says, they still haven't won. The same battle against famine, against despair, may have to take place tonight, tomorrow night, however many nights after. And Storm says, yes, but they are willing to fight that fight. You counter despair with hope, and that is what they stand for. Kitty tells Wolverine that she can feel the entity. He's there, watching, eager, hungry. But Wolverine says that's fine, because they are there too. And when the next relief planes touch down in the morning, they will be there to help. As will others in the future, be they mutant or human. But side by side, they will continue the struggle and provide hope. Heroes for Hope. Makes sense. Actually a pretty good tale. Marvel have been involved in plenty of other public service publications and worked with other charities. And those efforts, despite being well-intentioned, aren't always worthy additions to the characters' histories. But this was a good, solid story. It actually felt like a genuine X-Men book, probably because of Chris Claremont's involvement. Also, it achieved its goal of raising funds. Much like the X-Men's efforts, the fundraising helped. It undoubtedly saved some lives. But it didn't end the crisis. Maybe that is why the following year, the phone on the desk of DC's Vice President Dick Giordano began to ring. The call was from Jim Starlin and Bernie Wrightson. It seems their humanitarian efforts weren't over just yet. They proposed another comic book fundraiser, this time released by Marvel's big rivals. Something else that was different from last time was that, due to the experience of working on that book, they were prepared in advance. When the three men sat down to look at the proposal, Jim and Bernie already had a list of artists and writers and a 48-page plot outline. As with Marvel, everyone at DC was on board with the idea, especially Dick Giordano, who had already considered a comic book famine relief effort before Marvel stole a march on him the year before. It is now 1986, and in May, this hit the newsstand. Again, the company went with their biggest stars, being Superman and Batman. And again, they took the tag team approach to the story. A stack of writers, a host of artists, and lives in the real world genuinely hanging in the balance. In Marvel's book, Ethiopia was held back until much later in the story, as was the reveal of the villain. DC take a very different approach. As we find ourselves in Ethiopia on the very first page, along with Superman, in a tale in which we are told he will learn the limits of his power. Superpowers having limits? That's a novel concept for DC. There is a Western news reporter present covering what Superman is doing. He says he is not there to fight villains or crime, but famine. So yeah, DC really get straight into it. Superman is carrying a massive container full of tons and tons of rich topsoil, and he's emptying that onto what is up until now barren land in the hope of bringing some fertility to the parched wilderness. But that is just the tip of the iceberg, as we are told that he plans to do this hundreds of thousands more times, and hopefully the results of that will beat the famine. Although even he recognises just how daunting that challenge is. Just as he's coming to terms with that, he is given an additional layer of challenge. This in human form. A woman called Lee Ann Layton from the Peace Corps is there, and she is unimpressed with Superman's showboating. She says there are no easy answers to this issue, and that he is actually causing more harm than good, and continues giving him even more grief, describing him as the champion headline hog of all time. Fair play to Superman though, he does stick up for himself, telling her that she's out of line. He says he's not interested in warm press releases, he just does what he can. I guess she doesn't buy that. What is her problem? She reiterates that there are no quick and easy solutions here. How long exactly does he intend to work on this problem? To which he replies, 20 years! Wow, fair play to him. She says, case closed. I don't get it. Did she win? Anyway, Soups continues on his task, and as he returns with another container full of rich topsoil, it's destroyed. Superman's fine, but who did that? Well, we, nor Superman, know. Just yet. Not far from there, a relief plane full of food has been shot down, apparently the 6th in a row. Some of the pilots worked for the Wayne Foundation, and that means that the world's greatest detective is there looking for answers. It's a small world, isn't it? Seeing Superman passing overhead, he signals him down, asks if he'll do him a favour and study the wreckage of the plane to see if he can find any answers, or at least any clues. Superman studies the wreckage using his microscopic vision. Maybe if I was an expert in Superman I'd have heard of that before, but I haven't. Anyway, using his microscopic vision, he ascertains that what brought the plane down was some kind of particle beam, the kind of weaponry that neither side in the Ethiopian wars owns. We then get 2 pages of overly moody dialogue courtesy of Mike W. Barr, accompanied by overly moody artwork from Keith Giffen. I don't like it. I don't think the standard is particularly good, and I hate the random splashes of jet black shadow. Anyway, it's during these pages that our hero's plans are explained to us. They intend to seek the help of Lex Luthor. Yes, he's a villain, but he is also a scientific genius. Apparently, Superman found some files in which Luthor claimed that he had invented a serum of accelerated plant growth. Maybe he, one-time scourge of Earth, can prove to be its saviour. But he hates Superman, so Batman will go and try to negotiate with Lex, whilst Superman investigates how it is that whoever's behind these attacks on the planes knows their flight schedules. His investigations begin at the Wayne Foundation's Ethiopian offices in Addis Ababa. There he finds that somebody has put a tap on their telex machine. Telex! Fantastic. Not only that, but it seems that the staff have been replaced with androids. They begin to attack him, but he's Superman, so he puts them out of action with some heat vision. Now that I have heard of. Next, he follows the signal of that tap, and it leads him to the middle of the desert. Once there, he uses his super hearing to isolate the sound of the receiver, and that sends him directly underground, where he finds an incredible subterranean complex. It's here that he finds the evil mind behind all this destruction, and his name is the Master. Now, his motivation seems to be very similar to the X-Men's adversary, in that he feeds on lifelessness, hopelessness. The best kind of lifelessness of all is that which exists where once there was life. That is why the Ethiopian famine must happen, why it provides him with a particularly delectable form of sustenance. That's enough information for Superman to decide that this guy needs to be put out of action, and he quickly leaps to attack. But there's a strange kind of organ thing on the Master's chest, and that plays some strange music, which suddenly makes various metal objects around Superman gravitate towards him, to cocoon him, briefly. But when he does break free, he is shocked to discover that he's back outside again, with no sign of the Master or his base. Batman, meanwhile, is making his way to Luthor Island, but there is a welcoming committee, beginning with some heat-seeking missiles that are so efficient that Batman has to bail out from the Batplane in order to escape them. Then, after he touches down on the island, automated laser cannons seek to slow him down. But they don't. Batman has now made it into Lex's base, although there are still a couple of defences for him to overcome. He does, but what's really interesting at this point is it's starkly laid bare how contrasting some of the writer's approaches are to the same characters within the same book. Remember that mean and moody writing from Mike W. Barr? Well, that wasn't the only time in this book that Batman has been portrayed as humorless. Now, however, thanks to the writing of Robert Bloch, he's full of one-liners. Like here, when he says, "This isn't the ray of hope I was looking for," and "looks like somebody expected me to drop in." That is a pun, isn't it? You know, the parachute and all that. What you also notice at this point, and it happens a few times in this book, which I didn't notice at all in the X-Men one, is what appears to be a real lack of communication between the creators. Because after avoiding a couple of mini-missiles, Batman thinks, "I wonder whose pad I'm crashing." And then he exclaims, "Luthor. That is who you're looking for, isn't it?" And I've got to ask, how do I say this? Ah-ha-ha. Ha. Talk then, lightweight. I mean, is it laughter? Is he a bit lost for words? The art is good on these pages, though. Do you recognise it? It's Bernie Wrightson again, although this time there are no horror elements for him to get stuck into. Batman persuades him not to attack, to just let him talk. He explains about the problems in Ethiopia, says that Luthor, with his plant growth formula, could help to solve that awful crisis. Initially, Lex isn't interested, tells Batman to go back to Superman and deal with the problem themselves. But when Batman points out that Superman has tried and failed to solve that problem, suddenly Lex's attitude changes. He says, why didn't he tell him in the first place that Superman had failed? Of course he will help. Lex then shows him an example of what his growth formula can achieve. Those are giant tomatoes, by the way. Not particularly clear, is it? Batman tells him that by helping them out, he'll be a hero. But Lex isn't interested in being a hero. He doesn't want any of the credit. In fact, he goes so far as to say he couldn't care less about Earth. There's only one reason why he's doing this. It's because Superman couldn't. And he wants him to always know that he succeeded where Superman failed. I suppose Batman doesn't care. It's getting the help that matters. And now I turn the page. A new artist, a new writer, and here's that lack of communication again. Batman tells Lex he's still waiting for his answer. Haven't we had that already? And he notices that Lex is smiling. He wonders why, and then he gets it. And he says to Lex, "You are going to help, aren't you? And I know the reason why. You don't care about mankind's problems. You couldn't care less about starvation." Sounds familiar? Only one thing interests you, to show the world that you succeeded where Superman failed. And Lex confirms, Luthor succeeds where Superman fails. That's why he's really doing it. Yeah, I know, you told us just now. Superman is still in the desert, still searching for the Master, but he can't find him. The newly arrived Lex Luthor can though. He says that his supersuit has already locked on to the baddies' coordinates, 20 miles south from where they are. There are some really nice moments in this, with Lex gloating over the fact that Superman has had to come to him for help. Then, as our three protagonists discuss their strategy, a genuine Superman legend takes over the pencils. It's the one and only Kurt Swan, although his work doesn't look exactly the same under John Byrne's inks. As the three of them are discussing how they can once more infiltrate the Master's base, everything turns black. The Master has somehow prevented the sun's rays from reaching Ethiopia. When Superman investigates how this has happened, he discovers an even bigger revelation. It's not just Ethiopia that's been blocked off from the sun's rays, but the whole planet, the entirety of Earth, now encased in an opaque black sphere. Without sunlight, all crops will fail, ecosystems will collapse, and famine will spread worldwide. Now at this point, Barry Windsor Smith joins the charity effort. He is a very popular artist, although personally, sometimes I think his work is just poor. Not here. The emotional weight of the consequences of the Master's actions are clear on every character's face. Plus, he keeps a tight control on his otherwise sometimes random physical proportions. Global famine means even more despair, an even bigger void, a banquet for the Master to feast on. One of such magnitude that he would have unstoppable power. If there were any doubt before in Lex's mind, that is now gone, as he declares the Master must be stopped, now. And that isn't his only realisation. As our heroes, and Lex, make their way to the Master's base, they fly over a refugee camp. When they land to investigate further, Lex cannot ignore the horrors he sees. And, yeah, Barry Windsor Smith, all is forgiven. It's decided that the refugee camp is too close to the Master's base. People could be hurt in the final battle. Therefore, Batman is going to evacuate the camp, whilst the two once implacable foes take on their common enemy. The two make a suitably dramatic entrance, but the Master is quick to play another malignant melody, one that holds fast the Man of Steel in some kind of transparent cube. This is then followed up by, once again, a vast array of metallic objects, machinery, being attracted to our hero, until he is seemingly crushed. This is confirmed by the Master, but if that was designed to break Lex's spirits, it had the opposite effect. It was always his dream to kill the Man of Steel, and now the Master has taken that from him, and he ain't happy. Using his supersuit, he piles on the energy blasts, but ultimately it's to no avail. The Master says he can sense Lex's loss, the void that boils within him. His power has been transformed into one of hopelessness and despair, and that is something on which the Master feeds. Leanne Layton is back, preachier than ever. She berates Batman for putting so many people, already half dead, at risk. He realises the best way to protect them all is to help bring the battle to a swift conclusion. Meanwhile, Superman is exploring the new dimension that he was transported to. What? Yeah, it doesn't actually explain it, but it seems that that box, I guess, is some kind of mini black hole, or dimensional doorway at least, that sucked both Superman and all those bits of machinery into it. I guess it makes sense. It just wasn't clear that that's what was happening, especially after the Master confirmed that he was dead. Using a combination of his super sight, super flying and super speed, he manages to escape this new dimension through another portal moments before it closes for good. This gives the last son of Krypton an opportunity for another dramatic entrance, and Lex asks him, "Where have you been?" The writer for this bit is Len Wein. I guess he wasn't told that the last Lex was aware he thought Superman was dead, not just on some kind of jaunt. Rather than take on his two enemies directly, the Master plays another tune. This one creating 4 immense fireballs that then shoot off in opposite directions around the globe. This will take Superman out of the fight at least, as he leaves the scene to deal with these new threats. Jack Kirby fans, your man is up. As if you couldn't tell. Actually, it's very good of the King to help out DC after the way they screwed him over. I suppose it is for a good cause. Superman deals with the first fireball as it heads towards the Ethiopian capital itself, Addis Ababa. Come on, Master, give the Ethiopians a break. But he knows his work is far from done, as there are another 3 fireballs he still needs to deal with. Strangely, we aren't shown how he deals with the other 3 fireballs. It's safe to assume he does, though. Meanwhile, Lex is still battling the Master, and losing, until he realises how dependent the Master is on the sound waves emanating from that organ of his. So he decides to use his suit to produce his own sound waves, ones that not only cancel out the Master's, but produce devastating feedback. Don't worry, everyone's still alive, although Lex and the Master are both weakened, an opportunity that Batman doesn't pass up. Although his patented fly kick isn't quite as effective as he was hoping. The Master quickly gains the upper hand once more, but as he moves in for the kill, he finds he cannot move. Some invisible force is holding him. I think I know who's behind it. Lex is using Brainiac's force field to hold the Master back, but it has its limits, and bit by bit, the Master edges towards him. Lex's suit isn't strong enough to stop him. But somebody else is. How many dramatic entrances can one guy make? The creative team changes once more, and we get our last truly legendary artist. Do you recognise whose work it is? How about from this? That's some distinctive shading there. It is, of course, Joe Kubert, and it is he that shows us that the Master is dealt with actually in the most straightforward of manners. And just to completely eliminate his threat, Superman pulls off his organ. You know what I mean. With his box of tricks destroyed, light returns once more to the Earth. All that's left now is to take out the trash. And when they realise that the Master has left open that dimensional door through which he sent Superman earlier, well, it's a bit of a no-brainer. So with the main villain gone, what now? Well, it's back to the topsoil. Soon enough, Superman is back, emptying ton after ton after ton of the good stuff onto the arid land. He is then followed by Lex, who sprays his growth accelerator over the whole area. All they need do now is wait. And wait they do. They wait, and wait, and wait. But nothing happens. As Superman says, the dust has won. Lex's formula, successful as it was on his own planet, just doesn't work here. And the situation is summarised quite nicely as somebody says that the famine is a tragedy to be faced, not a trifle to be conquered. Who says that anyway? Oh no! She's back to do some more preaching. This time she gives us all a history lesson about Ethiopia. This goes back a bit further, beyond the Civil War, to the times when Ethiopia tried to capitalise on the popularity of peanuts. Basically, it wasn't handled well, and those crops helped to strip the soil of its nutrients. She says the desert is growing bigger with each passing day. It defies any magical overnight solutions. But the crisis can be beaten, not by superheroes, but by the entire world pulling together. I guess people like you and me? And Leanne watches the heroes fly off, knowing that they are going to help to spread awareness of this growing crisis. And just like the X-Men's book, we end with talk of hope. In literary terms, this wasn't as good as the X-Men's effort, but it was good fun. Is that allowed in the circumstances? A slightly less well put together offering there than what we got from Marvel. But now that all the superheroes have played their roles, how successful were they? Well, before Heroes for Hope even hit the newsstand, Bernie Wrightson himself had said, "There is no way a comic book can compete with a record album in generating money." And of course, he was right. But that isn't to downplay the comic's success, because it was successful. Jim Shooter, again on his blog, recalls handing the American Friends Service Committee an initial cheque for $500,000. And there was more to come. So, no, not the tens of millions raised by USA for Africa, but a significant and very welcome boost nonetheless. Sadly, try as I might, I can't find any details about how much money Heroes Against Hunger raised. If you know, please let me know in the comments and I'll pin it. Where the famine itself is concerned, it is officially recorded as ending in 1985, but relief efforts to counter the effects of the famine continued for years after. More than 500,000 Ethiopians were moved in efforts to locate them closer to areas where they could more easily access relief. And hundreds of thousands of tons of food and medical supplies were distributed across the population. The Civil War rumbled on until 1991. There was a further legacy of the famine relief comic books. These were the highest profile, but not the last such efforts. And since then, various charities have benefited from comic books created especially to support their cause. From UNICEF to the World Wildlife Fund, and even those affected by 9/11. But not, to the best of my knowledge, Oxfam.